Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Tony Haywood, and welcome to the East Anglian Branch Double IIRSM webinar, which today is being presented by Paul Robinson, the Managing Director of Robinson Management Services Limited, who has kindly agreed to talk to us on environmental risk management. Some of you may recall that Paul previously delivered a Star Wars related webinar to us back in May 2023, and we're delighted to welcome him back to the branch. We're also pleased that Paul is as well a member of the East Anglian branch. So without further ado, if I could hand you over to Paul Robinson, who's going to talk to us today about environmental risk management. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, for that kind introduction. And yes, so for those who were with us on May the 4th last year, you may have remembered the Star Wars themed event. Who could possibly forget that? But today we're talking a more sober event, really, something that's affecting us on planet Earth every single day. And we're talking about environmental risk and environmental risk management. So in terms of the schedule for today, we're going to spend about 30 to 45 minutes talking about risk management and environmental aspects and impacts. I'm going to start off with giving you a little bit of background about my business and what we do and how we play our part in protecting the environment. But I'm also going to provide you some context as well. This is very much UK focused, and I've tried to also give this an East Anglian slant as well, trying to focus in on some of the things that are affecting us in our region. Can also talk about some recent changes as well that you may or may not be aware of in regards to changes to ISO standards. RMS as a business, we work with ISO standards on a daily basis. And ISO have recently introduced some climate change related requirements that all major standards are adopting. So it's important that certainly if you've got certifications that you need to be aware of these important changes. Then we're going to get into the more practical aspects of risk management. So I'm going to introduce you to the concept of environmental aspects and impacts, talk about what they are, definitions, and walk through some practical examples as well. Talking about the conditions under which these environmental aspects and impacts may occur, and also thinking about what we can influence and what we can control when we're actually conducting risk assessments of our environmental aspects and impacts. We'll talk about the practicalities about managing and mitigating risk around environmental risk. And then finally, I'm going to give you a call to action, something that you can take away into your businesses and hopefully apply on a daily basis to help manage your impact on the environment. So a little bit about ourselves. RMS was founded in 2022. We're based in Milton Keynes, just on the edge of the Eastern region boundary. And as I look outside my window from my office there that's pictured, I can see the River Ouse. And over the last, well, crikey, 6 months really, we've seen that rise and fall with regularity. We've had a monumental amount of rain in the last 6 months. And that, of course, has caused environmental impacts, both for us, but also for people upstream and downstream as well. But that's just one of the many environmental considerations that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So from our side, we specialise in helping companies to implement and maintain ISO standards. And what we've tried to do right from the outset is build environmental considerations into our mission statement. So our focus is helping organisations to manage risk, continually improve and protect the planet through that implementation and maintenance of ISO standards. So that's the sales pitch. That's a little bit about us. Not going to touch on that anymore. We're going to get into now some of the considerations that we've been talking about there in terms of environment and the impact of climate change, just so that we can start to set the scene. In researching this presentation, I went back to the Met Office. As I mentioned, we've had some fairly extreme weather in the last 6 months here in the UK. And this is as a result of human-induced climate change. So some of the key stats here that the Met Office have recently produced, following last year's record-breaking year, 2023, the results from 2023, provisionally the second warmest year for the UK. If we all recall 2022, we had an absolute heat wave and months of parched earth, cracked temperatures of 40 plus, and despite 2023 not reaching those sort of conditions, it still was the second warmest year on record. In the Principalities, Wales and Northern Ireland also had their warmest years on record as well. And again, they were consecutive warmest years. In regards to the UK, 2023 is provisionally the warmest year for the UK for minimum temperature as well. So we hardly had any frosts, extreme cold weather in 2023. And human-induced climate change has made the UK's 2023 mean temperature significantly more likely compared to that pre-industrial climate that we used to enjoy, certainly before my time. And going over the water, Northern Ireland had its third wettest year in a series of 1836, and its wettest since 2002. I mean, they call Ireland the Emerald Isle, of course, and that's because it's famous for its rain, but yeah, third wettest year on record. So it's all undisputable data from the Met Office. Supporting that, we've also this year in 2023-2024 had a number of what I call named storm events as well. Again, this is an example of where climate change is having a real significant impact on us. And really from that point at the end of September last year, we've had a number of named storms. And just to really emphasize this as well, I mean, this was data that I pulled off from the Met Office about 2 weeks ago. Since then, last weekend, we had Storm Kathleen that hit the country quite hard and, caused quite a lot of havoc with high winds, again, extreme rain and gusts, which really affected all of our ability to get around and operate. So that's a countrywide level. In pulling this together for the Eastern region, IIRSM, I've also had to look at some of the more local challenges as well. We can see, and probably are familiar with, some of these news events that have happened in recent times. We've got Hemsby up there in the top left-hand corner. People are being evacuated from their houses as a result of these named storms battering the North Norfolk coast. We've got the storm defences there, top right at Happisburgh, absolutely devastated, and particularly pointless really in having them there. Absolute mess. We've got devastation to properties as well. Storms ripping through, hurricane force winds, destroying caravans, mobile homes, and also affecting the seafronts as well in some of our popular seaside towns up in North Norfolk and all around the Norfolk coast as well. So climate change induced weather events are having a major impact on our local and national infrastructure as well. Those of you who are familiar with the news, certainly the local news in the Eastern region, Hemsby, that North Norfolk coast area, contributes about £80 million to the UK revenue from tourism and from the activities that take place there in terms of businesses that operate in that area. So it's having a major effect actually on the country as well, and actually the country's ability to generate taxes as a result of these activities. So it's something that certainly the residents of these areas are really keen to focus in on. If they're having to move from these areas as a result of climate change and impact on their activities, businesses, this is having a real impact on people's lives. Just to finally emphasise the point, this is a map of East Anglia, and this is looking at East Anglia in 2050. Again, with human-induced climate change, we're looking at sea level rises and water level rises, and of course that's coupled with increased rainfall as well. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we're based on the River Ouse, and as we're coming from the left of this picture, the River Ouse runs through Stony Stratford, where we're based, all the way up through Newport Pagnell, up to Bedford, St Neots, and then empties out into the Wash. So we're heading into that red area with our stormwater, but also we've got to consider as well the impact from the rising sea levels as well. Now, this isn't to say that these areas in red are going to be underwater necessarily. However, they are at risk because they will become points in the map that are deemed to be below sea level. So this is a really important point now to be aware of, and the fact that the UK government need to also be aware of this and plan accordingly, really. Certainly, if we go over the North Sea to places like the Netherlands, much of their coastline is also below sea level right now. But anybody who's been there recently will know that we've got dikes, dams, etc. Protecting the coastline and basically keeping the sea out. So we may need to consider these kind of considerations when we're doing the forward planning for the UK. So what are the UK government doing about this? Well, to be fair, it's disappointing. The UK government itself has faced significant criticism for its environmental performance in recent months. And according to their own Office for Environmental Protection, it's failing on almost all of its environmental targets, putting nature at risk and potentially leading to an irreversible spiral of decline. Just to emphasise this, targets are not being met. Of the 40 environmental targets set for England, the government is largely on track to achieve only 4 of these. They're partly on track for 11, whatever that means, and largely off track for 10. For another 15 of these targets, there was insufficient evidence to be able to even assess progress. Coupled with that, we're looking at biodiversity decline as well. We're seeing a devastating loss of species all the way through from small birds, butterflies, insects, all the way up and down the food chain as well. And that's extending into poor water quality, fish dying, poor water quality management, toxic chemical controls. These are all falling short of targets, legally binding targets as well. And we're now, of course, out of the EU. However, the Environmental Act 2021 was introduced, which was designed to replace EU law, and at the time was fanfared as a significant piece of new UK legislation, which is going to protect the environment. However, progress on this has been absolutely terrible, and it's fair to say now that there is actually legal action being taken against the government. Because ministers and government departments are failing to meet the environmental targets that have been set within the Environmental Act 2021. So coupled with that, we're also rowing back on net zero commitment dates. That's been pushed out for another 5 years. The government is also issuing new oil and gas extraction permits. And there's been a lack of investment and policy around onshore wind electricity generation as well. However, all that said, we can't as human beings living on this planet, working in this country, just rely on the government and legislation or government intervention to save us from the effects of climate change. We know from these pictures that we just shared, climate change is happening to us. These named storms are on us. They're happening right now all over the country. So, do we have a magic bullet for this? Is there a solution out there that we can tap into? Obviously, over the recent years, we have been major progress towards EV batteries, EV cars, decarbonisation, and the UK has made good progress in this area. However, it's not necessarily the solution. What it does is effectively relocate the problem, if you like. So EV batteries, as an example here, rely on lithium, graphite, copper, nickel, and cobalt, precious elements that are basically dug out of the ground. Demand for these is going to rise and is rising exponentially as we make this transition away from fossil fuel vehicles, more towards lithium batteries and EV vehicles. So this demand is rising for metals such as lithium, copper, cobalt, leading to increased environmental impacts in areas where these are mined. And when you look at where some of these mines are, we've got places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where in some of these mines you've got children as young as 7 years old actually mining these elements. So not only is there an environmental aspect to this or an impact to it, we've also got the social impact to this as well. And right now, as we stand here, we don't have sufficient end-of-life products and batteries coming out of the system to be actually enable us to recycle or replace the extraction of these precious metals and minerals from the Earth's crust, really. And just to emphasize the scale of this, this is a picture of a copper mine in Australia. So you can see that the scale of this, that is a massive hole in the Earth's crust, which is obviously being used to extract these minerals from. So it's quite sobering when you see that picture, the size and scale of these operations. And of course, the impact on the environment. So I mentioned earlier, within ISO standards, there's been some recent changes. And these, I think, have been relatively well communicated out, but it's something that all organisations need to be aware of, regardless of what standard you may hold. So from February 2024, climate change issues are to be addressed in all major ISO standards. And when I say all major ISO standards, we're typically talking quality management, ISO 9001, environmental management, 14001, health and safety, 45001, ISO 27001, information security. So this is making companies and organizations think about climate change at board level. So within all major standards, we've got the context clauses, clause 4. And in 4.1, we now need to consider and determine whether climate change is a relevant issue and somehow capture that in developing our context. Further down in clause 4.2, the clause now states that we need to also consider those relevant interested parties that can have requirements related to climate change that they may place on your organisation. So whilst the overall intent of the requirements for clauses 4.1 and 4.2 remain unchanged, these new inclusions should ensure that climate change is considered across all organisations within any management system that an organisation holds. And it was quite encouraging, actually. Yesterday, I went out to conduct an audit of a client. They're based down in Slough, and they'd actually got climate change and climate change issues included within their context statement and the pestle analysis that they'd undertaken as part of determining the context of their organisation. So from a positive perspective, yesterday it was good to see that that's being considered at a strategic level. But this is something that all organisations really need to focus on. And it enables you to take climate change and climate change related issues into the boardroom. Another significant consideration as well here is in regards to environmental impact. And this is really reinforced again with some of the weather events that we've been having recently. So on the left-hand side of this image, we could see some examples of our impact on the environment. And things like, for example, pollution into rivers is well published here in the UK and is a significant issue that is getting a lot of headlines at the moment, and quite rightly so. We also need to consider the impact of the changing environment on us as well as a country, and at the local level and national level as well. And again, some of these images on the right-hand side here demonstrate that. We've had flooding into towns, affecting businesses, affecting high streets, affecting people in their homes. Again, people are having to move out of their homes. The insurance costs of replacing and repairing damage to these homes is enormous, and in some cases people aren't able to be insured anymore. So these are, again, are real considerations of real issues for individuals, but also companies as well. In the lower image there, again, casting our minds back to 2022, we had pretty much the country being parched as a result of a massive heat wave that we experienced, and really it's taken some time for the land to recover from that as well. So fundamentally here, formally our focus was on our impact on the environment from human activities, but this focus also needs to be maintained whilst also ensuring that we now consider the impact that the environment is actually having on us as well. So we're going to talk about aspects and impacts. So we're going to get now into the actual activity of environmental risk management, and just talk about some definitions here. We talk about environmental aspects and impacts, but do we really understand what that means? So in defining an environmental impact, this relates to any element of an organisation's activities, products, or services that can interact with the environment. In regards to that aspect's impact, that is the change to the environment. And that change can be adverse or beneficial. We don't have to necessarily think about all environmental impacts being negative in their nature. So we need to consider that when we're thinking about risk management. An environmental aspect can occur, something can interact with the environment, and that impact of that aspect or the interaction can be positive or negative. In regards to environmental aspects, this is where ISO 14001 helps us to determine what these are. And there's some really useful and insightful guidance actually in the back of ISO 14001 to help us to, again, get a proper understanding of what some of these environmental aspects are. And we'll go into these in a little bit more detail as well, because I've got a couple of examples where we can start to map activities, products, services against these aspects. So we've got emissions to air, pretty straightforward. These are emissions from our activities leaching into the atmosphere. We've got releases to water. water courses and wastewater, again, is a consideration here. And we've also got releases to land, something that, again, generally is unplanned, but can affect the land if it was to come into contact with the land. Typically, an example might be, an oil leak in a car park, for example. Then we've got use of your raw materials and natural resources. That takes us back to mining of natural resources and chopping down natural resources, trees, for example. And of course, use of raw materials such as water, wood, metal, steel, etc. We get use of energy, so that's typically either fossil fuels or electricity that can be generated from either renewable or a mix of fossil fuels and renewable. Generally in the UK now, about 40 to 50% of our energy, consumed energy, is from renewable sources. That's backed up with generally gas-fired or other sources of energy there to make up the 100%. And of course, nuclear is in the mix as well. Then on the other side of that, we've got energy being emitted. So this is lost heat, radiation in extreme cases, could be vibration, could be noise. So there's sort of nuisance type emissions, and light as well. Light pollution can be a big issue and have an impact on the environment. As a result of our activities, we also generate waste and, in some cases, byproducts as well. And interestingly, an addition in the last update was use of space as well, and that's a really interesting one to consider, particularly from an environmental standpoint, as to how we effectively use space within an organisation, so that we're not, say, for example, heating or cooling empty areas that we don't need to use. We need to consider these environmental aspects under certain conditions, and we can put some criteria against these conditions. The standard helps us by stating, we need to consider these under normal, abnormal, and emergency conditions. We can start to consider, what does that mean for our business? I've put some examples down here. Normal conditions might be your daily working time, whereas abnormal conditions might be those times outside of normal working hours, such as shutdown events, maintenance events, weekend activities, or out of hours working if you're working, into the evenings. And of course, emergency conditions, fairly straightforward, but this could consider fire, which is of course a health and safety concern there, but also fires can have a massive environmental impact as well in regards to emissions to air, but also emissions to land as well. And of course, in having to rebuild buildings, you're using materials, etc. Then we've got all other things. We've touched on extreme weather affecting organisations. This is particularly relevant, for example, with construction type companies where they've got live sites. Those sites are open air, and they're being battered by 40 and 50-mile-an-hour winds. That means that cranes can't operate, people can't work, and things can topple over. You can be in extremely muddy conditions if we get lots of rain, etc. So these, again, examples of where the environment is having a massive impact on us. And of course, in the mix there as well, we might have spillages or unplanned releases as well, either into land, water, or the air. We also need to consider whether we can actually control these things, or whether we can only have an influence on managing the aspect. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, take an office, for example. An office might be managed by a landlord or a building owner. And in that case, they may have control over the energy that's used in the building, the temperature settings that are used in the building, and many of the activities involved in maintaining the facilities management of that building. You might only be able to influence the landlord or building owner in that instance. So that might have an effect on how we score and undertake our risk management activities. On the flip side of that, you might have direct responsibility for the activities, and there's certain things that all companies will undertake where you will have that control and can apply control and maybe be able to make more of an effect in terms of change. And 14,001 also encourages to look at life cycle considerations, and this is a term within 14,001 that can cause quite a lot of confusion, because we get clients approaches and say, well, does that mean we have to do a life cycle assessment on everything that we do? No, it doesn't. What it means is we need to consider life cycle considerations when we're looking at risk and environmental aspects and impacts. Starting with designing and designing of products, facilities, processes, wherever possible, let's try and design out waste. Let's design in reusability, or the ability for those materials that we're using to be able to be returned to the earth. When we're requiring new materials, including the extraction, so as we saw in the mining example, we need to think about where those materials are coming from. How are they being obtained? And then as we get into then the operational activities, the creation of products, delivery of products, etc., and even into the use of products, we need to think about managing inefficiency all the way through the manufacturing process, and trying wherever possible to design waste out in all its forms to eliminate waste ultimately at the end of life wherever possible. So that helps us to apply the waste hierarchy effectively as well. In just briefly expanding on what I mean by all types of waste, a useful acronym to use here is Tim Woods. And if you see Tim Woods in any of your activities, products, or services, this is something that you can attempt to design out or take an action to eliminate this waste wherever possible. So this is used extensively in lean manufacturing as a good example of where you can focus in on trying to eliminate inefficiency, but also waste. Typical example here, transport. If you can reduce unnecessary transport movements, you're going to reduce the need for fuel. You're going to have less wear on the moving parts in that vehicle. You're not going to have to maintain that vehicle as regularly as you may be used to. So again, there's an environmental benefit to designing out waste in all of our activities. Swiftly moving on, I probably don't need to explain this to you. We're all risk professionals. We're all members of the IIRSM. But the definition of risk in this context, in the ISO context, we're talking about the effect of uncertainty, the deviation from the expected. And again, this can be positive or negative. So the risk can be expressed in terms of a combination of consequences of an event happening, such as an environmental aspect interacting with the environment, and the associated likelihood of that occurrence taking place. And within that context, we can think about our risk management model. I tend to go by the ISO 31000 model. Again, international best practice. It's referenced in all the standards, and this model can be adopted and tweaked to, consider environmental aspects and their risk impacts as part of that risk assessment activity. So I just want to show a couple of examples very quickly of how we can apply this risk model to a practical application. We might have, for example, an office. Typical office activities under the management of an FM company. You're going to have emissions to air. So typical offices, they run on gas boilers. That gas boiler may be managed by the landlord. It may be managed by yourselves. But there'll be flue gas emissions from those boilers. So we need to make sure we're effectively maintaining those boilers. Most offices have air conditioning, and F-gas leaks can be pretty devastating for the environment. In some cases, a kilo of refrigerant gas leaking into the environment can be somewhere around 2,000 times more damaging than the equivalent of CO2. We can walk down our aspects list. So we've got releases of water. So typically office environment, use of toilets, sinks, use of cleaning products. Again, there's a cost angle to that. Again, this is that grey area where health and safety and environmental management sort of cross over each other, where we're in this sort of environmental health space. Typically from an office, you wouldn't expect any releases to land, but then you're going to have raw materials, natural resources, use of paper, use of water, etc. Use of fossil fuels for the electricity generation, the natural gas generation when we're using energy. And the office may have, in some cases, a diesel backup generator. Again, diesel use there could be an environmental aspect. And of course, then you've got emergency considerations. What if the diesel spills, etc. So again, you can start to think about mitigation activities there. We've got energy emitted in noise, in heat. And if you put 30 people in an office for an hour, heat is going to rise just from putting those people in that room, even without heating being switched on. And then we've got generation of waste and byproducts. So we've got your black bin waste, recyclable waste, which is generally commercial waste. But then we might have toner waste, we might have batteries, we might have IT equipment, waste that gets generated from the office. And of course, the use of space there, how the office is laid out, how effectively are we using the space in the office? Taking it a step further, another example, similar type of approach, but in this case, it's a manufacturing organization, manufacturing steel products. So again, they're going to have space heating in the workshop. Again, flue emissions from that space heating. Typically, that's gas powered and gas fired. Releases to water, generally not. You wouldn't think, other than typical, toilet flushing, etc. And similarly, in regards to releases to land, you wouldn't expect anything there in terms of that release to land. But then we've got use of steel. We're making steel components. Where's that steel coming from? Is it recyclable or is it recycled content? Do your specifications allow for that, or do your client specifications allow for that? In machining centres, we've got use of water, use of oil, and of course, from an energy perspective, use of electricity, and also in some cases natural gas to fire these the equipment in the workshop. And again, different level, but we're going to have noise being generated. That could cause nuisance, and we've got a lot of heat being generated as well from motors in these machines, and again from the space heating and the people in the workshop. And then we're going to have swarf in terms of waste and byproducts. So we've got swarf, we've got scrap components, we've got first offs, we've got last offs that might end up in the scrap bin. We've got coolant, we've got waste cutters, that blunt that can't maybe be resharpened. So all of these things are factors that we need to think about in terms of how do we manage risk in these areas. And again, from a space perspective, we've got the factory layout. So as we touched on earlier, risk, as we know, is the effect of uncertainty. So we can undertake a calculation. I'm not going to propose any formulas here, but typically, again, 5 by 5 is a more often than not used approach in terms of putting some numbers against this. And again, you can apply your own criteria to those numbers. So what we can do here is consider risk in terms of the likelihood of the aspect occurring against the consequences if it was to occur, or the environmental impact if it was to occur. Factoring in, again, the ability to influence and control these risks and the conditions under which these aspects may occur, such as abnormal, normal, or emergency conditions. And we can also think about consequences. but not only just in consequences to the environment in terms of pollution, loss of diversity, loss of species, use of non-renewable resources, but we could also think about the financial impact of something negative occurring. What if you were to be prosecuted? There'd be fines involved with that, increased insurance premiums, and just from a general perspective, if we're creating lots of scrap, for example, or byproduct, that's going to increase our costs and ultimately reduce our profitability. And of course, we've got the reputational impact. If this was to, negatively occur, an environmental aspect occurs, we caused a pollution incident, you are going to get bad press. Just ask many of the UK water companies at the moment. You're also facing loss of revenue. You're also facing, clients and staff walking away from your business. They're not going to want to work for somebody who's been reputationally damaged or is seen to be a poor employer when it comes to protection of the environment. So once we've determined our risk levels, we need to think about then what are our significant aspects. So some examples here could be, for example, the significant aspect could be that those with the greatest perceived risk to the environment in terms of, if it was to happen, what would the catastrophic effect be? It could be those scoring above a stated risk threshold. So again, if you're using a numerical approach, that threshold could be set, and anything that pops up over the top of that threshold could be considered for treatment. It might be that you just rank the top 5, for example, aspects in terms of, again, their score, and attack those. And then hopefully over time, again, it should be able to reduce risk across the organisation. Or another couple of options there, those, for example, where you could turn a risk into an opportunity to reduce their potential impact. Or, of course, some of these activities come with legal requirements and obligations associated with them. So that could, in turn, be used to bump up the scoring potentially on the aspect. But again, I'm not going to tell you how to do that. That's entirely up to you. But we need a process for basically conducting a risk assessment and then determining, in your eyes, what you feel is significant. The key thing there is repeatability and consistency of approach. From there, we can start to think about risk treatment decisions and risk treatment actions. And in terms of those risk treatment decisions, again, there's some methodologies out there that can help us. A couple here, for example, if we're dealing with waste, you can apply the waste hierarchy. This is a risk treatment decision triangle where at the top we've got prevention all the way down to disposal at the lowest level. So if we can, again, design waste out, apply that waste hierarchy and also life cycle considerations there, again, it helps us to reduce that impact of waste. From an emissions perspective, this is a diagram I downloaded from the web. Again, it's a decision tree. So at the highest level, or lowest level in this case, at the top of the tree, you've got your offsetting options. You could offset those emissions, but it doesn't actually help you to eliminate them. You can look at reducing those emissions, rectifying and minimizing, and if possible, avoid the emissions in the first place. Look for an alternative way of achieving the same end. So that's the same decision tree, but turned on its head, and obviously focused on emissions. Or, as appropriate, you could take an existing approach. You may have a health and safety management system in place, and you can apply a health and safety hierarchy of controls, or twist them slightly to take the emphasis away from the person to the environment. The typical approach, again, applies. So elimination at the top of the tree, if you can eliminate the potential for environmental damage, then that's always the way to go. So to wrap up, I have a call for action. From what we've seen today, I think this demonstrates, and I hope this demonstrates, that a collective approach is needed. We can't just rely on government, but government and industry need to work together to address our impact on the environment and try to mitigate the environmental impact on us. It's fair to say that reversing man-made climate change is going to be difficult. It's not going to be an easy thing to achieve, but it's not impossible. And we know as businesses that addressing our environmental impacts helps save us money, it enhances our reputation, and it enhances the environment that we rely on as human beings to exist as a species. So please take this as a call to action to take management of environmental issues into your boardroom. We have an opportunity now with the changes that are made in ISO standards to really push climate change and the impact of climate change at board level. Hopefully the information in this presentation helps you to consider undertaking an environmental aspects assessment of your activities, your products and your services in order for you to understand and manage your significant environmental aspects. In doing so, think about life cycle as well, and life cycle considerations in regards to your activities, products and services. And of course, we can use and formalise our approach using those best practices contained within ISO 31000 and ISO 41000 as recognised models that are accepted and implemented on an international level. From there, then we can take risk treatment decisions and implement robust and meaningful controls that hopefully we can go back then and check to ensure that those controls are effective. And as appropriate, if we need to make adjustments, we can, in order to ensure that, again, we don't damage the environment. So thank you for listening to this presentation. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to the group today. Just going to open up for any final questions. So I'm just going to open up the chat.
Thank you, Paul. We haven't had any questions yet. Tony, do you have any questions for Paul?
Yeah, I'm going to be greedy. I'm going to ask a couple, actually.
Excellent.
Two or three things actually stood out in the the presentation for me, because obviously my background is more quality and safety as opposed to environmental. Now, Paul spoke at length about the recent changes to the ISO standards in terms of clauses 4.1 and 4.2 with regards to climate change. How would he approach it if during one of his audits or surveillance visits, climate change wasn't being perceived as a priority issue by top management?
That's an outstanding question. I mean, it's something that we're only starting to get a proper appreciation of, and with the introduction of these new requirements in all the standards, first of all, it's taking time for certification bodies to brief their assessors on these changes, but it's also taking time for these to get out into the broader area. And of course, I mean, taking your point there, Tony, if you've got a quality management system, and you're thinking about climate change in regards to a quality management system, that can take a little bit of getting your head around. But if you start to think about a quality management system in terms of the products, activities, services that you're delivering to your clients, and start to think about then the impact of climate change on, it could be your supply chains, it could be your downstream delivery of products to customers, it could be scarcity of resources required to make these products. If you've got, for example, precious metals in your products or anything like that. So that's where we start to think about how climate change and its impact is starting to affect our businesses beyond just the basics of are we going to have a storm event that could prevent us from working, or flooding in the factory or whatever it might be. So it does need that sort of broader focus, really, and it does need, I would suggest, top management within an organisation, i.e., the board of directors or whoever it is, to really start to think a little bit more outside the box in terms of how climate change can affect you. So I hope that kind of answers the question.
Well, that was my first question, Paul. The second one, I was intrigued because I didn't actually realise. So again, I've come away from today, learning something which is, which is always good. But you spoke there right at the outset of your presentation about the various government targets and where priorities were or were not being met, whatever the case may be. If you had to pick a top three of the priorities, which ones would you think the government would need to focus on in the first instance?
Oh. Wow, that's a big question. So if I was Prime Minister, I'd be looking certainly at decarbonisation, and putting in the necessary funding and infrastructure to enable us to transition to a carbon-free environment. So that extends to housing specifically, but also in regards to the grid as well, in terms of the national grid, the electricity production. So getting the right blend of grid energy, and that will, in my head, include the need to increase renewables. So, onshore wind would certainly be in my portfolio if I was, standing for Parliament next week. And if it was in my brief, that would be a definite focus. And I'm trying to again sort of take a shift away from the fossil fuel industry in terms of gas and oil use as well. Of course, that goes against some of the things that are happening out there at the moment. The government are continuing to issue permits for drilling oil and extraction of gas, whilst we continue on this transition. What I think is, again, personal view, it is disappointing is the fact that they've rowed back on now the commitment to achieve this by 2030, where UK was really taking a lead on this. Now, yes, it's difficult, and yes, we might not achieve it, but really, effectively, we've kicked the can down the road another 5 years, and we're seeing, in fact, we have seen in my local area, businesses as a direct result of that decision go out of business, and these are big businesses. We're talking about a business that 6 months ago was talking about a £200 million investment into the local community. So these decisions are having a major impact, not only on the environment, but also on businesses as well, and businesses' ability to plan, to implement change, and certainly at the national level. So it increases that focus really, and really emphasises the point I was making about trying to do this at the local level. Look within your business and see what effect you can make at your business on a small scale. And of course, if we're all doing that effectively, then that's going to help us to get to a better place.
Thanks very much for that, Paul. Is there any further questions that have come in on the chat, Julie, before I close the meeting?
No further questions, thanks.
Well,
Tony.
Yes, thank you, Julie. All that remains for me is to thank Paul for giving up his time this afternoon to present this webinar to us. It was certainly interesting and thought-provoking. What I would say to members of the East Anglian branch is that we are in the process of trying to organise and confirm dates for future events moving forward. So I would ask that you keep up to date by looking at the IIRSM East Anglian branch website and, of course, our postings on LinkedIn. Finally, just to remind everyone that the Risk Excellence Awards will be taking place at Church House, Westminster on the 23rd of May 2024. So there is availability online now for you to book tickets should you wish to attend that event, and we hope to see you there. But in the meantime, as I say, keep an eye on the website and LinkedIn, and we'll be in touch with future events once they are confirmed. And likewise, if you have any suggestions for future events yourselves, then please do not hesitate to get in touch with me or the East Anglian Committee. So we've nearly reached our hour, so it's time for me to say thank you everyone for attending and good afternoon.